Welcome back to Whiskey Uncut. I'm your host, Paul, joined today by James.
Hey, good to be back. It's been a while. We were just talking. We hadn't done a podcast since right after Christmas, so
We haven't.
yeah.
And here's the thing that's been happening in the internets, James, recently. It's people talking about Chat GPT. So I've turned to Chat GPT
Okay.
for our new intro, James,
Okay.
for season 3. Opening music plays. Now, this would work better if I had crafted the opening music.
And it won't write the music for you. It's just gonna. Okay, good.
Voiceover. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to season 3 of Whiskey Uncut, the show that brings you the finest whiskey knowledge and appreciation straight from the experts. This season, we're taking things up a notch with a new co-host, the man who knows his way around a whiskey barrel like no other, the one and only James.
It's a new co-host.
Applause and cheering.
Wow, this is good. It's so much better than what we could do, Paul.
Voiceover continues. Now, let me tell you a little bit about James. He's the ultimate whiskey aficionado, a true guru of the brown spirit, a master of the dram and connoisseur of the cask. He's the whiskey whisperer, the bourbon boss, and the Scotch sensation.
This is like the back of one of those bottles.
He's the man with the nose for nosing and the and the palate for tasting. The one who can tell you the exact age, barrel, and type and mash bill of any whiskey just by taking a sip.
Obviously.
He's the whiskey encyclopedia, the distillery dictionary, and the barrel bibliography.
How many nicknames are we doing here?
I'll tell you the prompt in a minute.
Okay.
He's the man who never drinks a dram without analyzing it, savoring it, and writing a haiku about it.
It's fantastic.
He's the whiskey poet, the spirit sommelier, the dram diplomat.
Wow.
He's the one who can make a blended whiskey taste like a single malt and a rye whiskey taste like a bourbon.
Obviously.
The whiskey
Yeah,
alchemist,
good.
the spirit scientist, and the barrel magician. He's James.
That's the second time I've been introduced.
More applause and cheering. So join us this season as we dive deep into the world of whiskey, from the classic Scotch to the bold bourbon and the smooth Irish to the peaty Islay, from the rare Japanese to the innovative craft. James and I will guide you through the history, production, the tasting, and the pairing of the best whiskeys in the world. So grab a glass, pour yourself a dram, and join us for another season of Whiskey Uncut.
I could drink all day. Like breakfast, lunch, dinner. Like, I don't care.
You can't drink out of this glass for shit.
Well, the problem, actually, James, I'm sorry to get rude so quickly, is you.
I'm going to bring up Ohio at any given cost.
Nobody should be putting this stuff in their body.
I smell metal and Greek.
The perfect bourbon is Michter's 10-year-old.
Oh, that's junk. Oh, that's junk.
We are going to be talking about today dusty bottles, but kind of more specifically 2 bottles you brought from Two Soul Spirits that are reminiscent
Right.
of old dusty bourbons. And then just for fun, I brought out a bottle of Glenfiddich that is my only like antique whiskey that I have. It's from the 1980s. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But really we wanted to talk about some Two Souls stuff today. Some shameless self-promotion.
Yeah, but it's a good conversation starter because there's been a lot of talk. Like all the reviews on these are 2 Finger Lake bottles. One of them is a 8.5-year wheated bourbon, and the other is just shy of 7-year rye. And Brian McKenzie, the owner of Finger Lakes, loves older bourbons. Like he likes stuff from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so when he started distilling, that was his goal. He wanted to create whiskeys that he felt reminded him of those older bottles. And I think you'll see he does a really good job of it. So when we've been pumping these out for reviews, everybody's been like, man, this is like a time capsule. This is like going back to the 80s and 90s and drinking dusty bourbons. And it got me thinking about that whole debate, right? There's this whole thing that's been going on. And this was a big deal when I first started collecting. This is in the day where you could still go out to, take a road trip and stop by a random like mom and pop liquor store and maybe run into a dusty, right? They were called dusties because they were been sitting on the shelf so long that there's dust covering them, blah, 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 blah. But it was mostly talking about, 60s, 70s, 80s whiskeys. But the debate has always been, are they better? Everybody went nuts over them, and it sort of became this big collector's item. I had friends who had hundreds of these things like stacked away in cabinets, and it didn't matter if it was garbage or good stuff. If it was 1980s, they had it.
Yeah.
And so there's always been this debate like, well, what's the difference between then and now? Is there really a quality difference, or is it just because we're so used to drinking the modern stuff that the older stuff seems like somehow more interesting now?
So, and I wish I had, I wish I could afford some more bottles of vintage scotch for you, because the exact same thing has happened in the Scotch community, obviously, is, it's like, okay, well, if a 50-year-old Macallan goes for, $50,000, well, you could also buy a Macallan from 50 years ago for a fraction of the price, but still a lot of money. I mean, it's still going to be like 10 grand or something, right? Yeah. So a lot of people have been going back and finding bottles like this, this is Glenfiddich Special Reserve Single Malt. It's from late 1970s or late 1980s, somewhere in that decade. It's hard. I have no way to pinpoint. So this bottle probably would have been like $10 at the time, or $15, or,
And that's the thing with the bourbons too. A lot of these, people are drinking Old Granddad, which was, I one time, my friend had a bottle of Old Granddad that we were drinking. It said $12 on it. Yeah. And you're like, okay, like people are going crazy over these things and paying thousands of dollars for them, and the sticker on it says $12.
Right. So the interesting thing with this is Glenfiddich claims, if you go to their website, and maybe they had Chat GPT write this for them.
They might have.
But they claim that they were like the originator of single malt. And they date 1969, I believe, as like the beginning of single malt whiskey. Well, it wasn't. All right. Single malt whiskey, you can find records all the way back to the early mid 1800s, as early as 1824, of writers talking about single malt whiskey.
And they called it single malt.
Well, they might not have used the term single malt, but they said like, oh, stop drinking this trash blend whiskey. Go drink Talisker. Go drink Lagavulin. Go drink, Brora, or sorry, not Brora, Kleinlich. It's Brora now. But so they were calling out distilleries individually, and they were saying they make good whiskey. Like, it's much better than blends. It's superior to blends, all this stuff. Now, these were primarily English and Scottish writers and people that were travelers, or, writing about their life, or, whatever. So those are kind of like the earliest documentation of single malt as a category, but it wasn't widely distributed. And a lot of that was to do with cost, and it was just because people didn't really know about it, like, that much. But don't be fooled. Glenfiddich did not invent the concept of single malt. It's not like, by definition, single malt is all whiskey made at one distillery. So every distillery that's been making purely malt whiskey in Scotland has been making single malt whiskey
for a very long
time. It's all been there. It's just a matter of whether or not it was advertised and sold to the public with that intent. And so and Macallan even has documents talking about like, how have our sales of the Macallan whiskey been doing, not whatever blend it was going into. So This has been around, but this is from the era of when single malt first started to be really focused on, and Glenfiddich did do that. They did popularize the concept of purchasing a bottle of single malt whiskey in the United States and selling it as a flagship product. So
here's my question to you. So in the world of bourbon, and I got into Dusty because I had a good friend of mine who, when I first moved in town, had a whole cabinet full of Dusties. And so when he was super, super generous, I'd go over and he'd pour all the old, like the old Fitzgerald and the old Granddad and old Overholt. And he had some wild turkeys in there and some old beams. And so I got to experience like a pretty wide variety of stuff from the 70s and 80s. And I think at the time, people were just starting to get into them a little bit. And then it really launched quickly and people went bonkers over it. And then there became this huge debate as to whether or not those bourbons were better. And again, we're talking $10, $15 bottles at the time, right? Like standard shelfers being better than than almost all the modern stuff. Is that the same way with Scotch? Like, is there this belief that for some reason in the 70s and 80s it was better?
100%.
And what is the basis for that? Like, there's very, I think, clear theories when it comes to American whiskey, but what's the theories with Scotch?
So the primary theory with Scotch is casks. So everybody thinks, and specifically, I think this has to do more with sherry cask whiskeys. And that's why I said this isn't the best example of this, because this is not a sherry cask whiskey. It's primarily ex-bourbon barrel. But with sherry cask whiskeys, the decline of the sherry industry and sherry as a popular drink has meant that more and more whiskeys being aged in sherry casks or being aged in casks where that sherry is produced almost just to season the barrel, and then it's kind of dumped out, and it's, cooking sherry rather than it being like really high-end sherry that would go for lots of money that was meant to be a delicacy, and then using those barrels. Now, the thing is, though, that people don't really think about this. There was a product, and I wish I could remember the name of it. There's a product that was basically like concentrated sherry flavoring. And the Scotch industry, for a while, they were allowed to use that in the sherry casks.
Ah, interesting.
Specifically in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And before it got removed. And so when you taste whiskeys, the sherry cask whiskeys from that time period, people will talk about, the sherry quality is so incredible.
Here it's an additive.
Yeah.
And they're like, wow, this is great.
Yeah. And it's basically complete bullshit, because what they were doing back then was they figured out, like, wow, we can get even more sherry flavor in the barrel with this like distilled, concentrated, they've got like Dawn dish soap of sherry that they're like dumping in the barrel.
Like sherry syrup going in.
To add additional sherry intensity.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so, so it got banned at some point. But it was like a really common practice. I meant to look up what it was. I'll check in a minute. But yeah, so that product is the reason why where sherry cask whiskeys taste very different than what they do now.
And people consider them to be superior because of that.
Some people, yeah.
And then the wood is the other component.
But it's kind of this fallacy of, well, is it better because it's different? Like it just tastes different.
That's what I never.
And so you think it's better just because it tastes different, or is it better because the wood was actually better? It's hard to know, because there was also like this additive going in there. There were some other practices going on because there was less regulation in the industry. And, so it's kind of hard to say. But what I will say, like, if you taste this Glenfiddich, in my opinion, the way that the style of single malt back, in olden days was not the way it is now, because they, like we talked about, prior to the 70s, the concept of promoting single malt as your primary product was not really popular, and it wasn't the majority of your portfolio. So you were producing whiskey mostly to be blended. And so I think when you taste this, it tastes a little more rustic, and it tastes like it's not as much designed to be something to drink on its own. And so I think that's a little bit of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And with American whiskey, it's interesting because Scotch has a very long history of it to draw on. With American whiskey, it's relatively new, but the era that everybody points to is really the same, which is kind of funny, right? Like Scotch has been around for a really long time, American whiskey much shorter, but everybody's kind of pointing to the same time period, which is the 70s and 80s. And with American whiskey, the theories are, first off, that there was different production methods then. Right now, everything's very automated. Then there was maybe a little bit more of an art to it. There's also rumors that...
So I asked when I was in Scotland, I asked them about that specifically. Because I wanted to know. I was like, so what is it about like these old whiskeys, like why they're so magical? And I was like, is it because there's like more art to it? And literally what Ian MacArthur told me, who's like a million years old, been working at Lagavulin for like 50 years, warehouse manager. He's like, if by art you mean we were all drunk off our asses and and bumping the dial like too far over when we were making it, he's like, yeah, that it was art, like, so that was basically his take on it was.
Yeah. And I think there's some of that too. I think what the automation has done is made it much more consistent.
Yes.
And that's where we're at now. It's like when you go and you pull something off the shelf, you know what to expect. I think there was a lot more variability then. And so, yeah, maybe some of that was outstanding. Mm-hmm. Some of it was probably crap. But there was also this, maybe this idea or this concept, especially in single barrel stuff, right? That you had these outstanding whiskeys at the time. They also talk a little bit about the wood. I've heard discussions about, old growth versus new growth forest and how it contributes sugars to it. I personally think one of the bigger things with bourbon is barrel entry. So right now, most people barrel their whiskey at the upper limit, which is 125. Mm-hmm. So they're putting it in between 120 and 125 proof, and it just ages differently. 70s and 80s, they a lot of times put it in around 100 proof. And so I do think there's something to that. But I have a hard time because I've had some 70s and 80s, like Old Granddad, and it's like a Werther's candy. Like there's just so much butterscotch in it. And I couldn't figure out what in the hell. It's not the grain. Grain's not going to give you butterscotch. Maybe the wood. But I don't think, the difference between 125 proof and 100 proof barrel entry is going to make it a butterscotch bomb.
Yeah. And I don't know how much this is true for bourbon, although I imagine it would be, is that there's also the factor that back then, a lot of distilleries used proprietary yeast strains. And so, and like with Scotland, they were more so using local barley and stuff, right?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing too, is everybody kind of uses ubiquitous yellow dent corn now.
And specifically with yeast, I asked the people at Lagavulin this, I asked the people at Talisker this, and they all said the same thing. They're like, yeah, pretty much everybody uses the same yeast. Because there's one yeast that has the highest yield, or one family of yeast, or whatever, or a couple of different strains, and they are just, if you're running a business and you're trying to produce the most liquor per liter and per ton of barley, and with the right amount of time to get the right cook time, so you can get 1,001 batches distilled per month versus 1,000, whatever it is, all those little optimizations, eventually people have figured out like, okay, it's just the flavor differences. People are happy to allow that drift of flavor over time to change, and we don't have to keep producing the same exact flavor we did in the 70s, because now with the same resources we can produce twice as much whiskey. Right. And so, that is certainly a factor as well.
Well, and I think that, the elephant in the room in this discussion is always, there's no before and after. Like, we don't know what happens to whiskey when it sits in a bottle for 50 years.
No.
Like, I wasn't born.
Nope.
In 1960.
And your memory and your palate certainly would not be the same 50 years apart for you to be able to know.
So even if you take a bottle of, let's say Wild Turkey from 1970 and you try it next to a bottle of Wild Turkey now, just because they taste different doesn't mean that 1970 Wild Turkey tasted like that when it was first bottled. We have no idea what it actually tasted like when it was bottled.
Right.
So
we do know it's mostly inert, but it's not entirely inert. And the distilleries that I've asked that question to that have been around for a long time, I asked them, why don't you have a catalog of your old whiskeys from the 50s, 60s, just to go back and taste so that you can try and replicate it, because that's what everybody wants. And they straight up told me that is pointless because we don't know what that whiskey actually tasted like coming off the still.
I mean, even small differences can make a huge difference in terms of the palate, right? And so, especially if you're using corks, there's air moving in and out. It's hard to predict. And so I will say that there is a a flavor profile with bourbons from that period that I think is a little bit different. For me, it's very funky. There's wood there, but it's almost like an antique wood. And the thing about Dusty's that jump out the most to me is the nose. They just pour out of the glass. I mean, it's a much different aromatic quality to them than what you get out of modern whiskey.
So that's what I was going to say about this Glenfiddich. So if you compare this to, which I wish I had a bottle of their current 12-year-old, but if you compare this Glenfiddich Pure Malt, which is blended from whiskeys 8 to 12 years old, is what it's reported, from the 80s, there's almost this like sour aroma to it, but that sour aroma kind of fades as it sits in the glass.
It's very fruity to me.
And it kind of becomes like a peach or like a, I think kind of like a
like
peachy
peach
aroma.
apricot, yeah, with some vanilla in there.
With some vanilla, but it's like a heavy kind of aroma. Glenfiddich today is not
It's
heavy.
not like that.
It is really, really light, and it's more green apple and Jolly Rancher kind of, but very, very light.
And I mean, there could be a difference too in where distillers are taking their cuts. Maybe were they letting a little bit more tails in back in the day? Because there's a lot of flavor in tails, and it tends to be fruity. So are they letting some of that in versus now? It's kind of hard to tell. Like, again, I don't.
Well,
I'm sure there's
everything-
some people out there who were distilling in the 70s who are still distilling now, but it's pretty
everything then was being done by hand.
yeah.
And
Now
so-
there's a lot of automation.
And now a lot of it's automated. Some distilleries still do all the cuts by hand, and so there is still some of some variability between batches. But like Glenfiddich, they do have for display. They show you like they have a guy come in and adjust it by hand, but is he really doing? Is that is that like the little side stream siphon that they do for show? At the
right.
facility?
Yeah,
it's hard to
tell.
say.
It's hard to tell.
But yeah, so I do think when I have tasted vintage whiskeys, they do taste substantially different from modern whiskeys.
I agree. Yeah.
However,
Why we don't know.
I think it's so many factors, it's not repeatable. This episode of Whiskey Uncut has been brought to you by our loyal Patreon members: Lorraine Denisi, Taylor Lauren, Dana King, Jacob Estrada, Rick Spencer, Harrison Hamill, Jonathan Richardson, Horncake, Ray Looney, and Steve128. Thank you so much for your continued support. And for those interested in supporting the show, please head over to patreon.com/maltmondays.